Hey friends, Pastor Bill Walden here with Build Up the Church. This is a devotional word for July 23rd. This is out of the book of Acts, chapter 26. In the latter portion of Acts, we see Paul is in jail for over 2 years in the city of Caesarea. It's a Roman prison. He was arrested originally in the area of the temple in Jerusalem. The Jews there thought he was bringing Gentiles into the inner courts of the temple, which was against their law. Under the penalty of death. And so they started to beat him to death. He was arrested by a Roman leader, a Roman soldier, and they wanted to keep the peace. And so they finally determined that Paul is a Roman citizen. And so they are going to present him before the leadership of the Jews in Jerusalem. But they determined that finally he needs to go down to Caesarea and be in jail there. And the Jews in Jerusalem, the leadership there, who have accusations against Paul, they need to go down to Caesarea. First, Paul is under the authority of Felix. After 2 years, another man named Festus comes in and he takes over. During this time, Paul has been sharing his faith with everybody there in the jail, and he understands that this is part of the mission that God has called him to. Back in Acts chapter 9, when Paul became a Christian, he was told by Ananias that God is going to send you to the Gentiles and to kings and to the Jews. And he is here in Caesarea testifying before the leaders of the Jewish nation and before many of the leaders of the Roman Empire. And so he is actually fulfilling that calling. We see here in Acts chapter 26 that he has been speaking to a man named King Agrippa. Now, King Agrippa doesn't have the authority to make a ruling on Paul's case, but he's there to hear Paul's case and to make suggestions to Festus, who is there not knowing quite what to do with Paul. Paul had already appealed to Rome, so in actuality, he has to go to Rome now. But Festus invites King Agrippa to come and listen to Paul's story so that he can make recommendations or give counsel. We pick up the story here in Acts chapter 26, verse 22. Therefore, having obtained help from God, to this day I stand. And Paul's talking. Witnessing both to small and great, saying no other things than those which the prophets and Moses said would come. In other words, Paul is saying, I'm just simply believing in the Messiah that the Old Testament prophets predicted. That the Christ would suffer, that he would be the first to rise from the dead. He would proclaim light to the Jewish people and to the Gentiles. So that's been his message all along. Verse 24, now as he thus made his defense, Festus, the one who is overseeing Paul's imprisonment, but who is not the guest of honor, he's there kind of as a secondary person. King Agrippa is the one hearing Paul's defense. But it says, as Paul made his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you are beside yourself. Your much learning is driving you mad. You're out of your mind. Paul was born in Tarsus, which was hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem, but moved there apparently in his youth and studied the Jewish religion, became a Pharisee, and was part of the Sanhedrin. And so he rose to the highest ranks. He was indeed a man of much learning. He's been sharing that as part of his testimony. And Festus, it just seems like insanity to him what Paul is saying about Jesus being raised from the dead. And once again, he says, Paul, you're beside yourself. You're crazy. Much learning is driving you mad. You've studied too much, man. You've been reading too many books. You've been thinking too much, and whatever Festus meant by that. But he said this in verse 25, but he said, I am not mad, most noble Festus, but speak the words of truth and reason. As a side note, Christianity is a truthful religion and a reasonable religion. It can be supported in so many ways by historical findings and the historicity of the internal elements of the Bible record, and archaeology and historical books beyond Christian historical books. And so he's saying, I'm speaking the words of truth and reason. And then he says in verse 26, for the king, before whom I also speak freely. Now he's talking about King Agrippa. He knows these things. For I am convinced that none of these things escapes his attention, since this thing was not done in a corner. King Agrippa had been in the place in Israel where he would have heard about all of this and heard many testimonies about this. Let me read that again. For the king before whom I speak freely knows nothing of these things, for I'm convinced that none of these things escape his attention, since this thing was not done in a corner. Christianity wasn't lived out in secret. It was all done very publicly. King Agrippa, now he turns the attention away from Festus, who is a mocker, and he turns it to King Agrippa. And perhaps he sees something in King Agrippa now, that Agrippa is leaning in and maybe nodding his head and listening intently with interest. And he says, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do believe. Notice that he doesn't say, do you believe in Jesus? He says, do you believe in the prophets? Because if King Agrippa believes in the prophets, he'll connect the dots, and those dots will lead him to Jesus. And so Paul is inviting Agrippa to come to faith. Verse 28, a well-known verse. Then Agrippa said to Paul, you almost persuade me to become a Christian. And Paul said, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me today might become both almost and altogether such as I am, except for these chains. When these things had been said, the king stood up, as well as governor and Bernice and those who sat with them. And when they had gone aside, they talked among themselves, saying, this man is doing nothing deserving of death or chains. Agrippa said to Festus, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. They all knew he was innocent. They all knew that he had not committed any crimes against the nation of Israel or against the Roman Empire. But the big verse that we want to focus on is this. Agrippa said, you know what, Paul, you have a compelling argument. You almost persuade me to become a Christian. But he didn't become a Christian. He was right at the threshold of becoming a Christian. It was reasonable. It was true. He had heard about it. Paul was making complete sense. Plus, he stood as a prisoner in chains, but he stood with dignity and integrity and with joy, telling his story about Jesus Christ. It must have been incredibly compelling. Here he is, probably in worn-out clothes, having been in prison for 2 years, perhaps having lost a lot of weight or something. We don't know, but the hardships of prison. And yet he has his head held high, and the stories that he's telling is true. And Agrippa says, you almost persuade me to become a Christian. Why not, Agrippa? Why not become a Christian? Well, Festus just said that he's crazy, and so if I become a Christian, Festus will think that I'm crazy. And I don't want that reputation. And my wife, Bernice, she's an immoral woman, and if I become a Christian, she might divorce me. And I might lose my position of influence in the nation and any number of other things. I might end up in prison like Paul. I'm pretty sure it's true, but I have to guard my life. I don't want to risk myself. What a sad place to be in. Would Agrippa ever have that chance again? Would he ever be at the threshold again of almost persuaded to become a Christian? It may be in our lives that opportunity comes once. If you find yourself ever at that place, if you're watching this today and you've never said yes to Jesus, and you find yourself at that place, there's no promise that moment of conviction and convincing will ever come again. Say yes to Jesus. Some things to think about. Thanks so much for watching.